I found the gold that destroyed my family. Not bandits took it, time itself did. Every ounce I dug cursed another soul. Now I'm back in Silver Creek, where the dead don't rest and the living don't forget. Some fortunes are too heavy for one man's conscience. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The ghost town of Silver Creek stretched like broken teeth across the desert valley, its weathered buildings standing as monuments to greed and broken dreams. Once, this place had been alive with the ring of pickaxes and the thunder of dynamite, when men believed they could tear fortune from the earth's bones without paying a price. Now the wind whistled through empty windows, carrying whispers of the dead and the stench of old sin. Marcus Kane rode into Silver Creek as the sun bled crimson across the western sky, his shadow long and dark against the dust-covered streets. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, worth more than most men saw in a lifetime, stepped carefully around the debris of collapsed awnings and rusted mining equipment. But Marcus barely noticed the animal's value anymore. Nothing held value when measured against the weight of 15 years' guilt. The town looked smaller than he remembered. Memory had a way of magnifying things, making them seem more important, more threatening than they truly were. But the cemetery on the hill, that looked exactly as he'd left it. Row upon row of wooden crosses, most bearing no names. The nameless dead of Silver Creek, buried in potter's ground because no one had claimed them. No one had mourned them. Marcus dismounted outside what had once been the Silver Dollar Saloon. The doors hung askew on their hinges, and the elaborate painted sign had faded to illegible streaks of color. Inside, he could see the skeleton of the bar where his father had drunk away the family's first strike, where his brother Thomas had gambled away their claim rights, where their mother had pleaded with tears in her eyes for them to leave this cursed place behind. They hadn't listened. None of them had listened. The Kane family had owned the richest claim in Silver Creek, vein number 7. They'd called it, a seam of silver so pure and so deep that it had driven 3 generations of prospectors to madness trying to find its source. But the Kanes had found it, and they'd pulled more wealth from that hole than they'd ever dreamed possible. Marcus's grandfather had struck it first, a modest success that had brought the family west from Ohio. His father had expanded the operation, hiring crews and buying equipment, transforming a simple claim into an industrial enterprise. And Marcus himself had been the one to discover the mother lode, a cavern of silver that defied imagination. For 2 years, the Kane family had been the kings of Silver Creek. They'd built the finest house in town, 2-story mansion with real glass windows and furniture shipped from San Francisco. They'd owned the general store, the largest stable, and held interests in 3 other mining operations. Marcus's younger sister Catherine had worn dresses that cost more than a mining crew's monthly wages, and his brother Thomas had carried a gold watch that chimed the hours like a church bell. But silver had a way of poisoning everything it touched. The more they'd pulled from the earth, the more the town had changed. Other families had grown desperate, jealous, hungry. The Cousins had tried to jump their claim, leading to the first killing in Silver Creek's history. The Brennan brothers had sabotaged their equipment, causing a collapse that had killed 6 workers in Tunnel 5. And through it all, the Kane family had kept digging, kept pulling wealth from the ground while the town festered around them like an infected wound. The final strike had come in winter. Marcus remembered the day perfectly, December 15th, 1854. He'd been deep in vein number 7 when he'd heard the commotion above ground. Shouting, gunfire, the sound of horses thundering across frozen ground. By the time he'd climbed to the surface, it was over. The Brennan brothers and their hired guns had burned the Kane house to the ground. His parents were dead, shot down like dogs in their own front yard. Catherine and Thomas had tried to run, but they hadn't made it past the creek before the bullets found them. Marcus had found their bodies at sunrise, frozen in blood-soaked snow. 23 years old, and suddenly the richest man in Silver Creek and the only Kane left alive. He'd buried his family in the town cemetery, for fresh graves on the hill that overlooked their claimed mine. Then he'd sold vein number 7 to the first bidder, taken his portion of the Kane fortune, and ridden out of Silver Creek with a vow never to return. The gold he'd carried, converted from silver at the Territorial Bank, had been enough to buy a new life anywhere he wanted. He'd chosen San Francisco, where money could buy respectability, and no one asked questions about where wealth came from. 15 years. 15 years of living with the knowledge that his family's death had been his fault. If he hadn't pushed so hard to expand the mine, if he hadn't been so hungry for more silver, if he'd listened to his mother's warnings about the jealousy and hatred growing in Silver Creek like a cancer, they might still be alive. Now he stood in the ruins of the Silver Dollar Saloon, watching the last light fade from the desert sky, and wondered what madness had brought him back. The letter in his saddlebag, the letter that had summoned him here, had been signed with a name he recognized but hadn't expected to see again. Elena Santos, the daughter of the Mexican family that had owned small claim adjacent to theirs. The girl who'd taught him to speak Spanish, who'd shown him which desert plants could heal wounds and which could kill. The woman who'd begged him not to leave Silver Creek after the massacre. The woman he'd left behind anyway, because staying would have meant facing the ghosts he wasn't strong enough to confront. Her letter had been brief but haunting. The Silver's calling them back, Marcus. All of them. The dead don't rest easy when their murder goes unpunished. Come quickly, or Silver Creek will claim more souls than it already has. The mine is active again, and the Brennan name isn't forgotten. Your family's killer has a son, and he's inherited more than just his father's violence. Elena Santos. Marcus stepped back into the street, his boots echoing in the empty silence. Somewhere in the darkness, he could hear the sound of metal striking stone. Rhythmic, deliberate. Someone was working the mines again, despite the town being abandoned. Someone was still pulling silver from the cursed earth of Silver Creek, still feeding the hunger that had destroyed everything Marcus had ever loved. He mounted his horse and rode toward the sound, toward the hills where vein number 7 had waited in darkness for 15 years. The past was calling him home, and this time he wouldn't run from it. This time he'd face the consequences of the Kane family's greed, even if it killed him. After all, some debts could only be paid in blood. Blood memory. The entrance to vein number 7 yawned before Marcus like the mouth of hell itself. Someone had cleared away the rockfall he'd ordered sealed 15 years ago, and fresh timber now braced the tunnel opening. Lantern light flickered deep in the shaft, and the rhythmic pounding of metal on stone echoed up from the darkness below. The mine was alive again, breathing with the sound of greed and desperate ambition. Marcus dismounted and checked his Colt .45. 6 shots. He'd learned long ago that in a place like Silver Creek, a man's survival often came down to the speed of his draw and the accuracy of his aim. The gun felt cold and familiar in his hand, like shaking hands with an old enemy who'd become a necessary friend. I wondered when you'd come back. The voice emerged from the shadows beside the mine entrance, soft and melodious despite the years that had passed. Elena Santos stepped into the moonlight, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. She was still beautiful, though 15 years had etched lines of hardship around her eyes and silver streaks through her black hair. She wore a simple brown dress and a worn leather jacket, but she carried herself with the same quiet dignity he remembered from their youth. Elena. Her name felt strange on his lips after so many years of silence. I got your letter. I wasn't sure you would come. She moved closer, her eyes studying his face in the dim light. You've changed. The boy I knew wouldn't have worn such expensive clothes or ridden such a fine horse. San Francisco has been good to you. San Francisco has been a prison. The words came out harsher than he'd intended. Every dollar I spent came from silver soaked in my family's blood. Every comfort I bought was built on the bones of everyone who died in this godforsaken place. Elena's expression softened. I know. I could see the guilt in your letter. The way you signed your name. The careful distance in your words. You've been carrying this weight for 15 years. I've been running from it for 15 years. Marcus holstered his gun and looked toward the mine entrance. But that doesn't explain why someone's working the claim again, or why you're still here. Everyone else left when silver ran out. The silver never ran out, Marcus. You know that as well as anyone. What ran out was the courage to dig for it. Elena's voice carried a bitter edge. After the massacre, after you left, the town tried to continue. Other families bought up abandoned claims, hired new crews, kept pulling ore from the ground. But strange things began happening. Cave-ins where the engineers said there should be none. Equipment failures that killed workers. Men going mad in the tunnels, speaking of voices calling to them from the darkness. She paused, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold desert wind. The stories say the Kane family's ghosts won't rest, that they're protecting the mine from anyone who tries to steal their silver. Most people think it's superstition, but I've seen things that change my mind. I've heard your brother Thomas calling from the depths of vein number 7. I've seen your sister Catherine's spirit walking the tunnels at midnight, still wearing the blue dress she died in. Marcus felt ice forming in his chest. That's impossible. Is it? Your family was murdered for silver, Marcus. Killed by men who wanted to steal what they'd spent their lives pulling from the earth. If that kind of injustice doesn't create ghosts, nothing does. Elena's eyes held a knowledge that chilled him more than the desert night. But that's not why I wrote to you. The problem isn't your family spirits. The problem is who's ignoring them. She turned toward the mine entrance, and Marcus could see fresh wheel ruts in the dirt, evidence of recent activity. Heavy wagons had been hauling ore from the tunnels, despite the town's reputation for being haunted and cursed. Jacob Brennan came back 6 months ago. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. Sean Brennan's son. The boy was only 12 when his father murdered your family, but he's grown into something worse than his father ever was. He brought a crew of miners from Colorado, men who don't believe in ghosts and don't care about curses as long as they're paid well enough to ignore them. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Jacob Brennan. He remembered the boy vaguely, a thin, angry child who'd followed his father around like a hungry dog. Sean Brennan had been a brute and a killer, but at least he'd been motivated by simple greed. What drove his son to return to Silver Creek? He claims the mine by right of conquest, Elena continued. Says his father wanted fair and square when he cleaned out the Kane family. The territorial government doesn't care about the legal details, and there's no sheriff within 100 miles to enforce what laws do exist. So Jacob Brennan has been stripping silver from vein number 7 like he owns it, like his father's murders gave him title to everything your family died for. Marcus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to flee Silver Creek 15 years ago rather than stay and seek revenge. But now it was tempered by something else, something colder and more dangerous. Purpose. How much has he taken? Thousands of dollars worth, maybe tens of thousands. He's got whole operations set up, processing equipment, smelting furnaces, even a rail connection to Denver. He's not just stealing your family silver, Marcus. He's getting rich from it. Elena's voice hardened, and every ounce of where he pulls from that mine is paid for with Kane blood. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the sounds echoing up from the mine shaft. The rhythmic pounding continued, steady as a heartbeat, the sound of men working through the night to extract wealth from cursed ground. There's more, Elena said finally. Jacob's not working alone. He's got backing from somewhere. More money than a miner's son should have access to. Someone with real power is funding this operation. Someone who wants the silver from vein number 7 badly enough to ignore 15 years of local superstition and territorial law. Any idea who? Elena shook her head. But I know where we can find out. Jacob's been staying at the old Kane house, or what's left of it. He rebuilt parts of it, turned it into a kind of fortress. If there are records of who's backing him, that's where they'll be. Marcus looked toward the hill where his family home had stood. In the moonlight, he could see the silhouette of reconstructed walls and a flickering light in what had once been his father's study. The sight filled him with a rage so pure and cold it felt like drinking ice water. Jacob Brennan was living in the house where Marcus's family had died, sleeping in rooms where Kane blood had been spilled, planning his operations from the desk where Marcus's father had tallied their silver wealth and dreamed of building an empire. "I'll kill him." The words came out flat and final, carrying the weight of 15 years of grief and guilt. "Maybe," Elena said softly, "but not tonight. Jacob's got 8 men with him, and they're all armed. If you go charging up there now, you'll just be joining your family in the cemetery." She touched his arm gently. "I have a place in town where you can stay. Rest. Plan. Figure out a way to destroy him without getting yourself killed in the process." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to ride straight to the Kane house and settle 15 years of injustice with his gun. But Elena was right. Jacob Brennan had money, men, and position. Marcus had only his rage and his skill with weapons. That might be enough, but it wouldn't be if he wasted his advantages on a suicidal frontal assault. "All right," he said finally, "but Jacob Brennan won't be stealing Kane's silver much longer. I promise you that." As they walked back toward town, Elena's hand still resting lightly on his arm, Marcus thought about the ghosts she claimed haunted vein number 7. Maybe his family spirits really were protecting the mine. Maybe they'd been waiting 15 years for him to return and claim what was rightfully theirs. If so, they wouldn't have to wait much longer. Ghosts and gold. Elena's shelter turned out to be the old church, the only building in Silver Creek that seemed untouched by time and abandonment. The wooden pews still stood in neat rows, and stained glass windows caught fragments of moonlight, casting colored shadows across the floor. A small living space had been carved out behind the altar, complete with a wood stove, a bed, and shelves lined with books and medical supplies. "You've been living here all these years?" Marcus asked, settling his saddlebags in the corner Elena had indicated. "Someone had to tend the graves." She struck a match and lit an oil lamp, filling the space with warm, golden light. "After everyone else left, after the stories of ghosts and curses drove the last families away, I stayed. Someone needed to remember what happened here. Someone needed to make sure your family wasn't forgotten." The simple statement hit Marcus harder than any accusation could have. While he'd been building a new life in San Francisco, trying to bury his guilt under layers of respectability and wealth, Elena had been here, keeping vigil, maintaining the graves of people who weren't even her family, carrying the burden of Silver Creek's dead when its living had abandoned them. "Why?" he asked softly. Elena was quiet for a moment, arranging blankets on a makeshift bed beside the stove. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old pain. "Because I loved you. Because I loved your family. Because someone had to stand witness to what was done and bear testimony when justice finally came calling." She turned to face him, and in the lamplight, Marcus could see tears glistening in her dark eyes. "Do you know what they did to your parents, Marcus? Do you know how they really died? The Brennans shot them. Everyone knows that. That's not all they did." Elena's voice grew hard, clinical. "I was there that night, hidden in the stable, watching through the window. They didn't just kill your parents, Marcus. They tortured them first. They wanted to know where your family's gold was hidden, the cash reserves you'd built up from selling silver. Your father held out for almost an hour before he finally told them about the strongbox buried under the kitchen floor." Marcus felt sick. All these years, he'd imagined his family's death as quick, violent, but mercifully brief. The reality was so much worse. "Your mother." Elena's voice broke slightly. "They made her watch while they killed your father. Then they made her call for Catherine and Thomas to come back to the house. When your siblings ran into the yard, trying to help, the Brennans were waiting." The church seemed to grow colder, darker, as though Elena's words were calling shadows from the corners. Marcus gripped the back of a pew so tightly his knuckles went white. "I wanted to help them," Elena whispered. "I had my father's rifle, and I could have taken at least one of the Brennans before they knew I was there. But I was 17 years old and terrified, and by the time I found the courage to act, it was too late." "You couldn't have saved them." Marcus's voice sounded hollow in his own ears. 4 men against 1 girl. You would have just died with them. Maybe. But at least I wouldn't have spent the next 15 years wondering what might have been different. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. That's why I stayed, Marcus. That's why I wrote to you. This isn't just about Jacob Brennan stealing silver from your family's mine. This is about justice that was never served. About debts that were never paid. Outside, the wind had begun to howl across the empty streets of Silver Creek, and the rhythmic pounding from the mine had stopped. Either the work crew had finished for the night, or they'd encountered something in the tunnels that had given them pause. Marcus hoped it was the latter. Tell me about these ghosts, he said. You mentioned seeing my brother and sister. Elena's expression grew troubled. It started about 3 years after you left. Miners working other claims began reporting strange things, voices calling to them from collapsed tunnels, shadows moving in places where no shadows should be, equipment that would work perfectly one day and fail catastrophically the next. At first, people blamed it on grief, on guilt, on the natural tendency to see phantoms in a place where so much blood had been spilled. She moved to the window and looked out toward the cemetery on the hill. But then people started seeing them. Your brother Thomas, still wearing the clothes he died in, walking the main street at midnight. Your sister Catherine, standing at the mine entrance, warning people away from the tunnels. Your parents, together, watching over the grave sites as though they were guardians protecting sacred ground. And you've seen them yourself? Many times. They don't speak to the living, but they make their presence known. Thomas likes to rearrange things, tools, furniture, personal belongings. He seems to be searching for something, though I've never figured out what. Catherine appears to children mostly, and animals. She calms frightened horses and leads lost pets back to their homes. Your parents. Elena paused. Your parents only appear when someone tries to disturb their graves or desecrate their memory. Then they become protective. Marcus absorbed this information with the skeptical rationality of a man who'd spent 15 years in civilization. Ghosts were superstition, the product of guilty consciences and overactive imaginations. But Elena wasn't the type of woman to invent elaborate fantasies, and she'd lived in Silver Creek long enough to know the difference between natural phenomena and supernatural intervention. What about Jacob Brennan? He asked. Has he encountered these spirits? He claims not to believe in them, but his men are nervous, and 3 of his original crew have already quit. They won't talk about what they've seen in the mine, but they left Silver Creek in the middle of the night without collecting their final wages. That says something about what they encountered down there. Elena returned to the lamp and turned the flame lower, casting the church into deeper shadows. There's something else, Marcus. Something I haven't told you yet. She reached into a wooden chest beneath the altar and withdrew a leather pouch. From inside the pouch, she pulled a small, gleaming object, a nugget of silver so pure it seemed to glow with its own light. I found this on your family's grave 3 days ago, she said, placing the nugget in Marcus's palm. It wasn't there the day before. Someone or something left it as a message. The silver was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been after lying in the cold desert night. Marcus had handled thousands of ounces of silver in his lifetime, but he'd never encountered or quite like this. It was perfectly pure, untainted by the copper and lead that usually accompanied raw silver deposits. It was the kind of specimen that existed only in the deepest, richest parts of a vein, the kind of silver that had made the Kane family fortune. Where do you think it came from? Elena's eyes reflected the lamplight like dark mirrors. From vein number 7. From the deepest part of the mine, where only your family ever dared to dig. I think your parents are trying to tell us something, Marcus. I think they're showing us that the Kane silver, the silver that rightfully belongs to your family, is still there, still waiting. Marcus closed his fist around the nugget. It felt heavier than silver should feel, as though it carried the weight of all the dreams and tragedies that had been built around it. If Elena was right, if his family spirits were truly protecting the mine, then perhaps justice wasn't as impossible as it had seemed. How many men does Jacob have working the day shift? Usually 4 or 5. The dangerous work happens at night, when fewer people might notice if something went wrong. Elena's voice carried a note of warning. But they're all armed, Marcus. Jacob's hired killers, not just miners. Men who've done this kind of work before. Marcus nodded, his mind already working through possibilities. He had advantages that Jacob Brennan didn't know about. Knowledge of the mine's layout, understanding of the terrain, and most importantly, the element of surprise. Jacob thought he was dealing with abandoned claims and harmless superstitions. He had no idea that Marcus Kane had returned to collect a 15-year-old debt. "I'll need supplies," Marcus said. "Dynamite, if you can get it. Fuses. Maybe some rope and climbing gear." "What are you planning?" Marcus looked toward the window, where the silhouette of vein number 7 was barely visible against the star-filled sky. Somewhere in those tunnels, men were stealing silver that belonged to his family. Somewhere in that darkness, the ghosts of his loved ones were waiting for justice to finally arrive. "I'm planning to give Jacob Brennan a taste of what his father gave my family," Marcus said quietly. "But first, I'm going to make sure he understands exactly what he's stolen, and exactly what it's going to cost him." The silver nugget seemed to pulse in his palm like a heartbeat, warm and alive and hungry for revenge. Dawn came to Silver Creek like a wound-bleeding light across the desert floor. Marcus stood at the window of the old church, watching the sun crawl above the eastern mountains and paint the abandoned town in shades of gold and crimson. From this vantage point, he could see the entire settlement spread below him. The empty stores, the collapsed houses, the cemetery on the hill where 4 white crosses marked his family's graves. And he could see the Kane house. Jacob Brennan had done more than just repair the structure his father had burned. He expanded it, turning the modest 2-story home into a fortress-like compound complete with guard posts, storage buildings, and a tall fence topped with barbed wire. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and Marcus could see men moving around the property with the casual alertness of professional sentries. "He's been busy," Elena said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. The aroma was rich and dark, a luxury in a place like Silver Creek. "Jacob's not just mining silver. He's establishing a permanent presence here, planning for the long term." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully. "Any idea what his endgame is?" "I've heard rumors, stories from the supply wagons that come up from Tucson every 2 weeks." Elena settled beside him at the window. "They say Jacob's got backing from railroad interests. Investors who want to establish Silver Creek as a major mining center, complete with rail connections and territorial authority. If he can prove there's enough silver in the ground to justify the investment, he could transform this place into a real city. Built on my family's graves." "Built on your family's silver," Elena corrected. "That's what makes this so personal, Marcus. It's not just about revenge anymore. Jacob's not content to steal what your family already mined. He wants to steal their legacy too. Turn the Kane name into a footnote in the Jacob Brennan success story." Marcus sipped his coffee and studied the compound below. 8 men, Elena had said, all armed, all experienced. Attacking them directly would be suicide. But there were other ways to wage war, ways that would force Jacob to come to him rather than the reverse. "How well do you know the mine's layout?" he asked. "Better than anyone except you, I'd imagine. I've been down there dozens of times over the years, mapping the tunnels, checking for signs of supernatural activity." Elena's expression grew thoughtful. "Why?" "Because I need to get into vein number 7 without Jacob's men seeing me. And I need to do it today, while they're occupied with other things." Marcus set down his coffee cup and began checking his weapons. Colt .45, hunting knife, Derringer tucked into his boot. "How familiar are you with explosives?" Elena's eyes widened slightly. "Familiar enough. My father was a mining engineer before he died. He taught me about blasting techniques, tunnel construction, that sort of thing. But Marcus, if you're thinking of collapsing a mine, I'm thinking of something more subtle than that." Marcus pulled the silver nugget from his pocket and held it up to the light. Even in the pale morning sun, it seemed to glow with inner fire. "This came from the deepest part of the mine, right? from chambers that only my family ever explored. That's what I believe, yes. Then there are parts of vein number 7 that Jacob's men haven't reached yet. Chambers full of the richest silver ore in the territory, protected by cave-ins and structural damage that would take weeks to clear. Marcus pocketed the nugget and turned from the window. I'm going to make Jacob Brennan an offer he can't refuse, and then I'm going to destroy him when he accepts it. The plan that formed in Marcus's mind over the next hour was audacious in its simplicity. Jacob Brennan was a businessman at heart, motivated by profit and the promise of greater wealth. If Marcus could convince him that there were unexplored chambers in vein number 7, chambers that contained silver deposits beyond imagination, Jacob would be willing to take risks he might not otherwise consider. The key was making the offer believable. Marcus would need to provide evidence of the hidden chambers, perhaps even guide Jacob's men to their location. But he would also need to ensure that the expedition became a trap, luring Jacob and his crew into a position where they could be eliminated without risking innocent lives. There's an old access tunnel on the north side of the mine, Marcus explained to Elena as they prepared for the day's work. My grandfather dug it as an emergency exit back in the early days, before we understood how stable the main shaft would be. It connects to the deepest chambers, but it's been sealed for years. If I can reopen it without Jacob's men noticing, I can use it to plant charges in strategic locations throughout the mine. Elena looked troubled. You're talking about murder, Marcus. About killing men who might not have had anything to do with your family's death. I'm talking about justice. Those men chose to work for Jacob Brennan, knowing what his father did to my family. They're stealing silver from Kane land, profiting from the blood of people they helped destroy. Marcus's voice carried the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Besides, I won't kill them unless they force me to. There are other ways to neutralize threats. The first phase of the plan required reconnaissance. Marcus spent the morning observing Jacob's operation from concealed positions around the mine, noting guard rotations, work schedules, and supply deliveries. The crew was efficient but not particularly disciplined. They relied on their reputation and firepower rather than tactical awareness to maintain security. That would be their weakness. Around midday, Marcus made his way to the sealed access tunnel. The entrance had been blocked with loose rock and debris, but the obstruction was designed to keep casual explorers out rather than determined engineers in. It took him 2 hours of careful excavation to clear a passage large enough for a man to squeeze through. The tunnel beyond was exactly as he remembered, narrow, winding, carved through solid rock by his grandfather's patient determination. The air was stale and cold, heavy with the scent of minerals and underground streams. Marcus lit a lamp and began the treacherous descent into the deepest parts of vein number 7. The mine's lower chambers were a labyrinth of natural caverns and artificial tunnels, carved over 3 generations of Kane family ambition. Marcus navigated by memory and instinct, following pathways he hadn't walked in 15 years, but which remained burned into his consciousness like scars. Every turn brought fresh memories, places where he'd worked alongside his father and brother, chambers where they'd celebrated particularly rich discoveries, tunnels where they'd shared dreams of the empire they were building. And everywhere the silver waited. Veins of were so pure and plentiful that they gleamed in his lamplight like frozen lightning. This was what Jacob Brennan was really after, not just the silver that had already been mined, but the vast deposits that remained untapped in the depths of the Kane family claim. Marcus set his charges carefully, placing dynamite at structural points throughout the lower tunnel system. When detonated simultaneously, the explosions would collapse multiple chambers while leaving the main shaft intact. Anyone caught in the lower levels would be trapped, but the mine itself would remain accessible for rescue operations, assuming rescue was deemed worth the risk. The work took most of the afternoon. By the time Marcus emerged from the access tunnel, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. Now came the dangerous part, making contact with Jacob Brennan and delivering the offer that would lure him into the trap. Marcus cleaned himself up as best he could, changed into his finest clothes, and rode openly toward the Kane compound. He made no attempt at stealth or concealment. When Jacob's sentries challenged him at the gate, he gave his name clearly and requested a meeting with the man who'd stolen his family's property. The response was immediate and predictable. Within minutes, Marcus found himself surrounded by armed men and escorted through the compound toward the reconstructed Kane house. The sight of his childhood home, altered and corrupted but still recognizably the place where his family had lived and died, filled him with rage so pure and cold it felt like drinking liquid nitrogen. Jacob Brennan was waiting for him in what had once been the family parlor. He was a tall, thin man with his father's cruel eyes and weak chin, dressed in expensive clothes that couldn't quite disguise the essential cowardice of his nature. But his confidence was real, backed by money and armed men and the certainty that he held all the advantages. "Marcus Kane," Jacob said, not bothering to rise from his chair. "I wondered if you'd come crawling back eventually. 15 years is a long time to nurse a grudge." 15 years is a long time to plan revenge," Marcus replied evenly. "But I'm not here for that. At least, not today. I'm here to make you rich." Jacob's expression shifted from mockery to suspicion. "Is that so? And how exactly would you propose to do that?" Marcus pulled the silver nugget from his pocket and tossed it onto the table between them. It landed with a soft thump that seemed to echo through the room like a gunshot. "By showing you the chambers your miners haven't found yet," Marcus said. "The ones that make everything you've pulled from the mine so far look like pocket change." Jacob's eyes fixed on the nugget, and Marcus saw greed flicker across his features like flames licking at dry wood. The trap was set. Now all Marcus had to do was convince Jacob to step into it. Jacob Brennan picked up the silver nugget with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the same hunger that had driven 3 generations of men to their deaths in Silver Creek. He held it to the light, examined its impossible purity, weighed it in his palm with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent his life dealing in precious metals. "Where did you find this?" His voice had lost its mocking tone, replaced by the sharp focus of a businessman sensing unprecedented opportunity. "From chambers in the mine that your men will never reach," Marcus replied. "Chambers that my family sealed before we left. Chambers that contained silver deposits that would make the territorial governor weep with envy." "And you're willing to show me these chambers? Out of the goodness of your heart?" Jacob's suspicion was evident, but it warred with the greed in his eyes. Marcus settled into the chair across from Jacob, the same chair his father had used during family discussions, before the world had collapsed around them. "I'm willing to make you a business proposition. Partnership terms. You have the equipment and the workforce to properly extract silver from the sealed chambers. I have the knowledge of where they are and how to reach them safely. Together, we can pull more wealth from this mine than either of us could access alone." Partnership. Jacob rolled the word around in his mouth like he was tasting something bitter. "With the son of the family my father killed." "Your father killed my family for silver, Jacob. I'm offering to give you more silver than he ever dreamed of." Marcus kept his voice steady, professional. "This isn't about the past anymore. This is about the future. About what we can build together if we're smart enough to put old grudges aside." It was a masterful performance, and Marcus could see Jacob responding to it despite himself. The man was fundamentally greedy, and greed made people stupid. All Marcus had to do was make the temptation strong enough, and the risks seem manageable. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus leaned forward, projecting the intensity of a man sharing precious secrets. "There are 3 sealed chambers in the deepest part of vein number 7. My grandfather found them, but they were too dangerous to mine with the equipment available at the time. The silver deposits are concentrated in pockets that would have required extensive tunnel work to access safely, so the family decided to wait, to develop them when we had better resources." He paused, letting Jacob's imagination fill in the details. Each chamber contained silver worth at least $50,000, maybe more, but accessing them requires precise engineering and absolute knowledge of the mine's layout. One mistake, and you trigger collapses that would bury the entire operation. Jacob was leaning forward now, his eyes gleaming. And you know how to reach these chambers safely. I know where every support beam was placed, every tunnel dug, every possible point of structural failure. Marcus tapped the side of his head. 23 years of working that mine, Jacob. 23 years of learning its secrets. That knowledge is worth more than all the silver you've pulled from the upper tunnels combined. What do you want in return? 50% of everything we extract from the sealed chambers, and a guarantee that my family's graves remain undisturbed. Marcus watched Jacob's face carefully. That's more than fair, considering I'm offering you access to wealth you could never find on your own. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying the silver nugget. Marcus could practically see the calculations running through his mind, the potential profits, the risks, the possibilities for betrayal once the chambers were located and their contents assessed. When would we do this? Jacob asked finally. Tonight. The work has to be done in darkness, when other people won't notice the preparations. The access routes to the sealed chambers are unconventional. We'll need privacy to avoid questions from territorial authorities or competing interests. Marcus had chosen the timing carefully. Night work would allow him to control the environment more completely, and it would limit the number of witnesses to whatever followed. If things went according to plan, dawn would rise over Silver Creek to find Jacob Brennan and his operation permanently neutralized. I'll need guarantees, Jacob said. Insurance that this isn't some elaborate revenge plot. You'll have them. Bring as many men as you want. Arm them however you see fit. All I ask is that you follow my directions exactly when we're in the tunnels. The sealed chambers are surrounded by unstable geology. One wrong step, one misplaced charge, and we'll all be buried under tons of rock. Jacob stood and walked to the window, looking out over the mine where his crews had been working for months. Marcus could see him calculating potential profits, weighing risks against rewards. The greed was winning, as it always did with men like Jacob Brennan. All right, Jacob said finally, but we do this my way. My men, my equipment, my security protocols. You guide us to the chambers, and keep your mouth shut about everything else. Try anything clever, and I'll leave your body in the tunnels with your family's ghosts. Marcus nodded solemnly, hiding his satisfaction. Agreed. But Jacob, once we're down there, once we're in the sealed chambers, we're all dependent on each other for survival. The mind doesn't care about our history. It only cares about whether we respect its dangers. As the sun set over Silver Creek, Marcus made his final preparations. He'd already placed the charges in strategic locations throughout the lower tunnel system. The detonators were connected to a single trigger mechanism that he could activate from a safe distance. All that remained was leading Jacob and his men into position and ensuring they were all in the right place when the explosions began. Elena waited for him at the old church, her expression troubled but determined. Are you certain about this plan, Marcus? Once you detonate those charges, there won't be any going back. There was never any going back, Marcus replied, checking his weapons one final time. The moment Jacob Brennan decided to build his fortune on my family's graves, he signed his own death warrant. I'm just the one delivering it. And what about afterward? What happens when the territorial authorities investigate? When questions are asked about the mine collapse and Jacob's disappearance? Marcus smiled grimly. Accidents happen in mines, Elena. Cave-ins are common, especially in operations that push too hard and ignore safety protocols. Everyone will assume Jacob got greedy and took risks that cost him everything. At midnight, Marcus rode to the mine entrance where Jacob and 4 of his best men were waiting. They carried enough firepower to outfit a small army, rifles, pistols, dynamite, and enough ammunition to fight a sustained battle. Jacob clearly didn't trust his new partner, but his greed had overcome his caution. Ready? Marcus asked. Ready, Jacob replied. His eyes held the cold gleam of a man who thought he was about to become incredibly wealthy. Lead the way, partner. Marcus led them into the mine, down through the main shaft toward the depths where silver waited like frozen fire in the darkness. With each step deeper into the earth, each turn through tunnels carved by Kane family labor, Marcus felt the weight of 15 years lifting from his shoulders. Justice was finally coming to Silver Creek, and like all justice, it would be paid for in blood. The deepest chambers of vein number 7 stretched like cathedral halls beneath the desert, their walls gleaming with veins of silver, so pure they seemed to glow in the lamplight. Marcus led Jacob and his men through tunnels that grew narrower and more treacherous with each step, past caverns where underground streams whispered secrets to the darkness, deeper into the earth than any living man had ventured in 15 years. "Jesus Christ," breathed one of Jacob's men, holding his lamp high to illuminate a chamber wall thick with silver ore. "I've never seen anything like this." "No one has," Marcus replied, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "This is what the Kane family died protecting. This is why your father killed them, Jacob. This is the silver that's been waiting in darkness for 15 years, growing more valuable with every passing season." Jacob moved through the chamber like a man in a dream, running his hands along walls that sparkled with mineral wealth beyond imagination. His men followed, their expressions shifting from professional wariness to awed greed as they realized the magnitude of what they discovered. "How much?" Jacob whispered. "How much silver is down here?" "More than you can extract in a lifetime," Marcus said. "More than the entire territorial government has seen in 5 years of taxation. Enough to buy yourself a governorship, or a seat in Congress, or your own railroad, if that's what interests you." It was true. The sealed chambers contained silver deposits that dwarfed everything the Kane family had extracted during their years of operation. Marcus's grandfather had discovered these caverns, but lacked the technology to mine them safely. His father had mapped them, but decided the risks were too great for the equipment available. Marcus himself had explored them as a young man, dreaming of the empire he would build when the time was right. But the time had never come. Instead, the Brennans had murdered his family and scattered those dreams like ashes across the desert wind. "The extraction will be dangerous," Marcus continued, watching Jacob's men spread through the chamber with the fascination of children in a candy shop. "These chambers are connected to underground streams that could flood the tunnels if we're not careful. And the rock formations are unstable. Too much blasting could bring down the ceiling." "We'll be careful," Jacob said, though his voice carried the distracted tone of a man already calculating profits. "My boys know how to handle explosives." Marcus nodded and moved toward the far end of the chamber, where a narrow passage led deeper into the mine's bowels. "There's more. 3 more chambers, each one richer than this, but they're harder to reach, and the geology is even more unstable." He was leading them deeper into his trap, drawing them toward the positions where his hidden charges would be most effective. The plan required precise timing and considerable luck, but Marcus had spent 15 years preparing for this moment. He wouldn't waste it on careless execution. As they moved through the deeper tunnels, Marcus began to notice things that made his skin crawl. Shadows that moved independently of their sources. Cold spots where the air felt thick and oppressive. And sounds, whispers that might have been underground streams, or might have been something else entirely. "You feel that?" asked one of Jacob's men, a grizzled gunfighter named Keller. "Feels like someone's watching us." "It's just the mine," Jacob snapped, though his own voice carried a note of unease. "Underground spaces play tricks on your mind, make you hear things that aren't there." But Marcus knew better. He'd felt this presence before, during his childhood explorations of the deepest tunnels. Something lived in the dark spaces beneath Silver Creek, something that had been here long before the first miners arrived, something that resented the intrusion of greedy men into its domain. His family had learned to respect that presence, to acknowledge its claim to these chambers. The Brennans, apparently, had not. "There," Marcus said, pointing toward a chamber entrance partially blocked by fallen rock. "The richest deposits are in there, but we'll need to clear the passage first." Jacob's men immediately began moving rocks, their greed overcoming any caution they might have felt about disturbing formations that had been stable for decades. Marcus watched them work and mentally calculated the time remaining before his charges would detonate. 20 minutes, perhaps less. Just enough time to position everyone correctly and make his escape through the concealed access tunnel. Marcus. The voice came from behind him, soft and familiar. Marcus turned, and his breath caught in his throat. Thomas stood in the tunnel entrance, exactly as Marcus remembered him, but translucent in the lamplight. His younger brother wore the same clothes he'd dyed in 15 years ago. Work shirt, canvas pants, boots caked with Silver Creek mud. But his eyes were different, ancient, filled with a patience that belonged to eternity rather than mortal time. "Thomas," Marcus whispered. Jacob's men couldn't see the apparition. They continued clearing rocks, oblivious to the supernatural presence watching them from the shadows. But Marcus saw him clearly, saw the sad smile that crossed his brother's ghostly features. "It's time," Thomas said, his voice carrying the sound of wind through empty places. "Time to finish what was started. But not this way, Marcus. Not through murder and revenge. That path leads only to more graves." "They killed you," Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the sound of moving rocks. "They killed all of you. They deserve to die." "They do," Thomas agreed, "but not by your hand. Not in a way that makes you the same kind of monster they were." The ghost moved closer, and Marcus felt a cold that had nothing to do with underground temperatures. "There's another way. A way that serves justice without destroying your soul." Before Marcus could respond, shouts erupted from the chamber where Jacob's men were working. The rock fall had been cleared, revealing a passage that led to the most magnificent silver deposits in the entire mine. But something else had been revealed as well, something that made hardened gunfighters stumble backward in terror. The passage was filled with light, not lamplight, but a soft, silver radiance that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. And in that light stood figures that Marcus recognized. His parents, his sister Catherine, and other members of his family who had died in Silver Creek over the years. All translucent, all patient, all waiting. "What the hell is that?" Keller screamed, raising his rifle toward the ghostly assembly. "The Kane family," Jacob said, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and fascination. "The stories were true. They really are protecting the mine." The spirits didn't speak. They simply stood there, blocking the passage to the richest chamber, their presence making it clear that the silver beyond belonged to them, that it would always belong to them, that living men who tried to steal it would face consequences beyond their understanding. "Stand aside," Jacob snarled, pulling his gun. "I don't care if you're ghosts or hallucinations. I've come too far to be stopped by dead people." He fired 3 shots into the passage. The bullets passed harmlessly through the spirits, striking the silver-veined walls behind them and ricocheting into darkness. The ghosts didn't flinch, didn't react. They simply continued watching with the infinite patience of eternity. "They can't hurt us," Jacob said, though his voice carried less confidence than his words suggested. "They're just echoes, memories. We'll blast through them if we have to." That's when Marcus made his decision. Not the decision he'd planned, not the revenge he dreamed of for 15 years, but the choice his brother's ghost had urged him toward. He stepped forward, placing himself between Jacob's men and the passage where his family spirits waited. "No," Marcus said quietly. "No more blasting, no more digging, no more stealing silver from the dead." Jacob's gun swung toward Marcus. "What are you talking about? This is what we came for. This is what we agreed to." "What we agreed to was based on lies," Marcus interrupted. "My lies. There are no sealed chambers, Jacob. No secret deposits. No partnership between us. I brought you down here to kill you, the same way your father killed my family. I planted charges throughout these tunnels. In 10 minutes, this entire section of the mine will collapse, burying you and your men under tons of rock." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whisper of underground streams and the soft sighs of spirits waiting in silver light. "But I'm not going to do it," Marcus continued, "because my brother's right. Because justice served through murder isn't justice at all. It's just more death added to a pile that's already too high. Jacob's face contorted with rage and betrayal. You son of a bitch. You lying, scheming. I'm going to give you a choice, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the chamber with absolute authority. The same choice you gave my family 15 years ago. You can leave Silver Creek tonight. Pack up your operation, take your men, and never come back. Or you can stay and face the consequences of stealing from the dead. He gestured toward the passage where the ghostly figures waited. Because they're not going anywhere, Jacob. My family will be here long after you're buried and forgotten. And every day you remain in Silver Creek, every ounce of silver you steal from their mine brings you closer to joining them in the darkness. Jacob's hand trembled on his gun. Around the chamber, his men shifted nervously, their eyes darting between the living man, threatening their employer, and the spirits blocking their path to wealth. The weight of decision pressed down on them like the tons of rock and earth above their heads. 10 minutes, Marcus repeated. Then the charges detonate whether you're here or not. Choose wisely, Jacob, because you won't get another chance. The countdown had begun, and in the silver light of the Kane family's eternal vigil, justice waited to see which path the living would choose, the way of honor, or the way that led only to deeper darkness beneath the unforgiving earth. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.